Hi, and welcome to Axel Bank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Dr. Rebecca Brenner Graham, the author of Dear Miss Perkins, a story of Frances Perkins' effort to aid refugees from Nazi Germany. This is her first book, and her writing has appeared in Slate, Time, and the Washington Post. Dr. Graham, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Evan, for inviting me.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. Right now, there are 15 heads of federal departments that make up the president's cabinet. 5 women are serving Donald Trump. 5 served Biden, 3 served in Trump's first term, 9 served Obama, and 6 served George W. Bush. 87 years ago, though, Frances Perkins became the first woman to serve as a cabinet secretary. Dr. Graham writes that it was a striking change for reasons beyond the high heels that stood out beneath the cabinet meeting table, as she describes. Most importantly, FDR's Secretary of Labor had a quality that we know as empathy. Before we get into why it's important for this story, Dr. Graham, first I want to ask, what happened in Frances Perkins' early years that led her to develop this critical attribute for a public servant?
There were 3 most formative influences. The first was when she was an undergraduate at Mount Holyoke College. She had a professor named Anna Mae Soul, who was part of a broader progressive movement. She taught a class called American Economic History that required undergraduates to visit the mills in Holyoke, Massachusetts, and experience predominantly immigrant workers' working conditions and what they were up against in those turn of the 20th century mills. The second one was when she moved to Chicago to be a teacher. Perkins taught science. She volunteered pretty much all her free time at that stage at Hull House, the famous settlement home founded by Jane Addams. And Jane Addams had a co-founder, and I feel bad I forget that woman's name.
That's
but Frances,
right. She understands.
Frances Perkins and other upper middle class white women like her would use their education and their privileges to support Hull House in its endeavors. What was extraordinary about Hull House was it provided not only food and shelter to a wide array of people in need, but also entertainment, education, and a sense of community. So Perkins was part of that, and that was formative to her. She wrote back to friends on the East Coast, quote, "Social justice will be my vocation," end quote. The third formative moment is quite sad, which is that she saw the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire happen in March 1911.
I'm sorry, we're not talking about just that she read about it in the papers or that she went by the wreckage afterwards. She saw it going down.
That's right. Nobody wants to see it. I mean, for me, it makes my heart stop when a kid decides to ride a bicycle down a metro escalator, which is something I saw happen a few weeks ago while on book tour. The kid was fine, but I had to, stop and just
You needed
breathe.
a minute. Yeah, you needed.
And when something like that happens and makes me panic, I think of what a worst case scenario it must have felt like to watch workers die. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire was in the middle of New York City, so a lot of people saw it, including Frances Perkins. It also happened on a Saturday, and the people who died had already been campaigning for safer work conditions and more reasonable work expectations at the factory, and then they lost their lives on the job. So she watched that happen, and she later referred to it as, quote, "the day the New Deal began."
There are some people who would see things like that or be part of groups like that and have the opposite reaction, or maybe not any reaction at all. What was in her childhood that led her to react to it in a way that made her feel bad?
I think it's difficult to convince someone to care. And by extension, it's difficult to suss out why some people care and others don't. I can only state that she did. She was deeply concerned by it. It then became her next role to lead New York State's Fireplace Safety Investigating Committee. She was appointed by, at that point, former Governor Theodore Roosevelt. And she worked on workplace and fireplace safety procedures across the state of New York.
She was born in 1880. What would a typical life have been for a girl and then a woman who was born at that time?
Frances Perkins was born in 1880. That is correct. Many, many times in her life, including at important moments, she told people she was born in 1882. That was not a mistake. It was a deliberate decision, likely to appear not older than Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But in 1880, she grew up in Massachusetts. She had a family that had been in the U.S. since before it was the U.S. She had some famous ancestors. Um, there are a wide range of experiences of what it would have been like to be a girl during that time period. I mean, if somebody was born in Hawaii in 1880, they would have seen the overthrow of the Hawaiian
Mm.
kingdom, right? If someone was born in 1880 to parents who had been emancipated during the Civil War, they might have other experiences, poverty, racism, varying degrees, maybe depending on where they lived. So there were so many different experiences. Some specific characterizations of Perkins's childhood are that her family, while not super, super rich, they were privileged enough that they expected her to go to college, which was certainly not the case for everyone at that time. And after college, there were fewer jobs for women, which is why she started out teaching science, even though she had hoped to go straight into the fledgling field of social work.
How was she recognized by FDR as a potential Secretary of Labor?
Yes, so first she was recognized by Governor of New York Al Smith in the 1920s, and she served on his state industrial commission. And then Al Smith convinced Franklin D. Roosevelt to run for governor of New York, right? That's a whole story in 1928. Al Smith lost the presidential election and was kind of out of politics and mad at FDR for some reason. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the new governor of New York in 1928. And Frances Perkins had done very well on the Industrial Commission. There's one letter from a labor dispute somewhere in the state that says, "Ask the governor where you found that woman." I use that as a section title in chapter one. And then Franklin D. Roosevelt appointed her from the Industrial Commission to serve as the Industrial Commissioner for the state of New York, which was essentially Secretary of Labor for the state of New York. So then when he ran for president in 1932 and won, women's groups had been campaigning since they had earned the right to vote a little over a decade earlier for the first woman cabinet secretary. It was likely that he would pick one. The Department of Labor actually did not have much status because it was relatively new. It had been started in 1913. And that mattered within the cabinet. I mean, I don't know if they still do this, but they sat around the table in order of seniority.
Well,
So
that's
she
it
was
is how the succession, the line of succession goes by when the order, when the cabinet department was created.
Right. So, very recent department. And since she was the first woman cabinet secretary for the state of New York and doing a similar job of putting people back to work during the Great Depression, that was what he appointed her to do for the country. At the same time, there are also reasons it was unlikely that she would be appointed. Previously, the Secretary of Labor had been a rank and file labor union leader. She was not. Most trade unions did not have women in them. Instead, she was part of this social reform movement. She knew Jane Addams and Florence Kelley and Belle Moskowitz and all these women who cared about causes that she cared about too.
What was FDR nervous about nominating a woman? Did that come up in does that come up in the public record?
In the FDR Presidential Library records, there is a mixture of mail that he received upon appointing her. I don't know how he responded to those people, but it was a mix of people congratulating him for making a great decision and also negative responses, which were either trade unionists saying they expected there to be a union leader, or also just hate mail from people who didn't like her or were misogynist bigots or something like that, which is a theme,
When it
ongoing theme.
when it comes to some cabinet secretaries and even some vice presidents, presidents send them off on their way and go do your job and go do your thing, and I'll call you if I need you. What was the relationship like between FDR and Frances Perkins? How much of an ongoing back and forth was there?
It evolved a little bit because at the beginning of the Roosevelt administration, she was the person that had worked with him the most directly. His other cabinet appointees were Washington insiders, whereas she came from New York with him. So he knew many of them, but in terms of day-to-day work, he already had an established working relationship with Frances Perkins. They were definitely close. They shared values, they had the same politics or very similar politics. They even were both Episcopalians, and Frances Perkins notes on several occasions that that was something that connected them. And as the administration evolved, there's a great book called Unlikely Heroes by Derek Lieber. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, but it discusses Perkins, Harold Ickes, Henry Wallace, I think, is one of them, and then Harry Hopkins. I think those are the four, and how they served Roosevelt throughout the administration in different capacities, and that they all worked together too. She had good working relationships with many of the cabinet secretaries, even though she clashes with the Department of State a couple times in my book. That was Secretary of State Cordell Hull, who was also there the whole time. But I also wanted to mention that there is a turning point in my book and also in her workings in the administration, which is the resolution to impeach her on the Hill in the
Oh, we're gonna get
early.
there. We're gonna
Oh,
get there.
okay.
I've got
In
questions. Don't worry.
1939. Yeah,
Yeah,
that definitely changed how everyone related to each other, and she kind of took a step back a little
yeah,
bit.
we're gonna get to all that. I promise. I promise. What are the? I want to ask about the Labor Department a little bit here. What are the roots of the Labor Department? You mentioned 1913, so that's a sort of a Taft, Woodrow Wilson era type department. What did it have under its writ that the Labor Department would be responsible for?
It had split with the Department of, I want to say Commerce was the one that was attached to it. And then when they split and became two different departments, the Immigration Bureau and the Naturalization Bureau each stayed in the Department of Labor. I think that the Immigration Bureau was originally in the Treasury Department. I mean, the takeaway here, which we're definitely seeing today in 2025, is that the structure of bureaucracy is not fixed. It changes based on social priorities. 1913 was absolutely the progressive era. It also happened to be the year that President Woodrow Wilson permitted the resegregation of the federal government, and that had some lingering consequences. Perkins actually desegregated the cafeteria at the Department of Labor when she became secretary.
So that's 30
So,
years. I mean, that's 30 years that it was segregated for.
yes. And when she became Secretary of Labor, first she went to an emergency cabinet meeting because there was a national banking crisis the first week of the Roosevelt administration. And then on, I think, the second day of the administration, she went to the building for the first time. It was, I believe, on G Street in Washington, D.C. It is not where it is now. Today, it's the Frances Perkins Department of Labor building, and it's right on Constitution Avenue. But she went to the Department of Labor building, and several men informed her that they were in charge of immigration. That was a red flag to her that something is administratively chaotic. And one of her first actions as Secretary of Labor, despite coming to Washington to work on putting people back to work and labor reforms and workplace safety reforms, but one of her first actions was she asked the president for an executive order to combine the immigration and the naturalization bureaus to create the Immigration Naturalization Service. That allowed Perkins to consolidate authority and to initiate reforming the immigration system. Before she was Secretary of Labor, the INS had habitually conducted deportation raids across the country and spent Labor Department energy and resources that way. And she sought out to redirect the priorities, and she did in a wide range of ways. Some of them ended up relating to refugees from Nazi Germany. Not all the ways did, but there were many small changes she made with larger impact that allowed her to do subsequent work.
And what was American immigration policy as World War II began? I mean, as you mentioned, it was controlled under the Department of Labor, which is interesting. But what were the policies and how did Americans view immigrants?
The law on the books was the National Origins Act of 1924. That's the one that listeners might remember memorizing for high school, or maybe since
Or
then.
maybe not remember.
The National Origins Act, also known as the Johnson-Reed Act, Perkins actually called it the Quota Act in her correspondence sometimes, established quotas from all the countries from which the U.S. accepted immigrants. The quotas were highest in Western and even Central Europe, very low in Eastern Europe. In most countries, it was about 100 people. I used to tell my high school students that's fewer people that are in this building right now. And that law used, I think it was 1890 census data was like what was available in the early 1920s when they were creating it, and also racist pseudoscience to calculate the numbers. And what Congress intended to do was to exponentially increase the numbers of white Western Europeans in the US. It wanted to, I'm not great with numbers, it wanted to duplicate the demographics in a way that exponentially increased the ethnicities and races that the congressman saw as more desirable. Congress was not an independent actor here. They were elected by Americans who thought that they were doing a good job. And so anti-immigrant sentiment, xenophobia, was predominant throughout the interwar period, and of course lingers to this day.
When it comes to the dialogue nationally about immigrants in the early or in the mid 1930s and then early 1940s, what was it? What was the prevailing sentiment about who the Americans are and who the others are?
Depends who you ask. Interestingly, what comes to mind for me, the way you phrase that question, is a lot of the hate mail that Perkins received and that people who worked for her received because they'd sign it. An American taxpayer, an American citizen for over 50 years, and or an American voter. And many of these people who happen to be men, and they didn't specify that they were white, but you can kind of get that they're white and Christian from their writing and what they say about other people. And they identified as citizens, taxpayers, and they wanted to keep the privileges of citizenship to themselves and people who looked like them.
Curious about the forces shaping global trade? Current Accounts, the Henrik Foundation Trade Podcast dives into trade policy, economics, and global trends, from the rise of protectionism to the challenges of non-tariff barriers. Brought to you by the Henrik Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to sustainable global trade. This podcast delivers valuable insights for policymakers, business leaders, and educators. Subscribe now on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. Stay informed and shape the future of global trade.
I've teed this up for a little while here. We've been framing this whole discussion here, but I want to get into some of the beef of this discussion here. When did Perkins first start to keep an eye on Nazi Germany, and how did that compare with the president's own monitoring?
When the cabinet secretaries took their oaths of office ceremonially at the White House on March 4th, 1933, the uh, country of Germany had democratically elected Adolf Hitler as chancellor earlier that year in late January 1933. So that was a situation that was in the newspapers. Perkins also had an inside source, which is that she was personal friends with journalist Dorothy Thompson, who was one of the first Americans to write about what was happening in Germany as a journalist overseas. And then back in DC, literally telling Perkins and other people in person. This was not the Holocaust yet, far from it. That was almost a decade later, but it was a bad situation where Jewish people in Germany were no longer able to provide for themselves and take care of their families due to no fault of their own, and that became an existential threat. So immediately, as early as March, April 1933, there was an influx of applications to immigrate to the U.S. From Germany. So the Department of State was actually in charge of consuls overseas that would actually decide whether the visa, whether each immigrant could come to the US. And then once the immigrant was in the US, that was when it became under the Department of Labor. So this all teed up the first clash between the Labor Department and the State Department in April 1933. So, right at the beginning of the administration, working relationships not established yet. Secretary of State Cordell Hull was aware about the influx in applications to immigrate. The first volley of this battle was in a cabinet meeting in April. And Perkins had come prepared. She was someone who was always prepared. She really didn't have the luxury of being anything less. And she had collaborated with people in her networks who had advised her on, should we get into the charge bonds controversy here?
Not yet.
Okay.
Not yet, but that's okay. Before we, because it's so interesting to talk about what people viewed Hitler as when he first took office, and there's that famous New York Times piece that just says Hitler not seen, or something to the effect of Hitler not seen as extremist threat by U.S. analysts.
When Dorothy Thompson, Perkins's friend, was kicked out of Germany in 1934, it was not for calling Hitler evil, it was for calling him irrelevant. In a piece that a long form piece that she published called I Saw Hitler. I mean, people don't know what's going to happen, right? In 2025, we know what's happening. We don't know what's going to happen. That's always the case. People can't predict the future. I find it compelling that Franklin D. Roosevelt had read Mein Kampf. We know that for certain, just because he was an educated person who knew German and like followed world events, and it was widely circulated, especially in Germany. I have not read it. I'm not interested in reading it, but the point here is that the ideology was clear without knowing what would come of it.
What were her early experiences with Jewish people?
She did not know many growing up. There's a letter that I saw while I was researching the book, that I went back to the archive to see after I finished the book. Basically, in around May 1903. So when she's 1 year out of college, she wrote a letter to her graduating class that's in the Mount Holyoke archives. She has a couple of my favorite Perkins lines ever are in this same letter. I went to Mount Holyoke, so like there's a personal connection. She says that you can pretend that 1902 girls under the caps and gowns and you'll never be lonely. She says that she hadn't found a full-time job yet and she was destined to stay home and kill her father with her cooking. Those two lines are in it. But here's another thing that she says. She says she was a substitute teacher for Jewish immigrant kids. And you know how that can be. That's not the exact wording, but the tone was something that I would read as othering. And I kind of ignored it at the time of reading it just because it wasn't directly related. But then I went back after I finished the book. To look at this letter. And I wrote an essay for Jewish Women's Archive about how Perkins's relationships to Jewish communities evolved throughout her life. At the beginning of her life, there were none. Around the time she graduated college, she might have had some assumptions. And I sent this letter to, like, I happen to be Jewish, but I also have many Jewish friends. I sent them the letter just to see, like, how they'd react to it. They said, it's just like a model minority framing. But they were other. She was not of these communities. However, once she joined the social reform movement, she came into contact with many more Jewish people. By the time she showed up to the April 1933 cabinet meeting, she had conferred with Felix Frankfurter, Charles Wyzanski. She had many people in her networks who happened to be Jewish. But Cecilia Rozovsky is one of the heroes of this book on child refugee policy. And Cecilia Rozovsky was born to poor Jewish immigrant parents. She herself was a child laborer, a practice that Perkins would contribute to abolishing. And I contrast their upbringings a little bit in this essay for Jewish Women's Archive.
I want to ask about how you put this together a little bit here. I can guess where you got the title of the book from. Obviously, you probably came across that phrase in a million letters that you read. What sources did you use to put this all together?
This project was originally my undergraduate thesis. And over a decade ago, my entry point to it was what I call the Dear Miss Perkins letters at the National Archives at College Park, Maryland. Their actual name would be the immigration folders in Record Group 174, which is the subject files of the Secretary of Labor, right? There's many Labor Department files, but these are the Secretary of Labor's subject files. So that was my entry point. And my thesis used those mainly. Then I did my dissertation on something else, which isn't relevant to this conversation. And then when I came back to this book project after graduate school, there were a couple other places that I wanted to look. One was the Mount Holyoke Archives, which is just better for broader context, right? Like her early years, later years, Mount Holyoke archived everything in the news that related to her. But then the place that I wanted to go that I had not been yet was Columbia University Archives, which has her personal papers because that's where she or her family donated them. And the two chapters in my book that draw most heavily from those, because I only spent a week there. I would have had more time if I wasn't a full-time high school history teacher using my breaks. But
Oh my gosh.
the impeachment resolution and the transfer of the INS were the two chapters that I found the most in her personal papers. And at the National Archives at College Park, in addition to the subject files, I also looked at the Children's Bureau records, the Department of the Interior records, some others as well, because I had fellowships from the White House Historical Association and the National Archives Foundation. So I spent a whole summer break pretty much at the National Archives at College Park. I also sometimes went downtown into the INS files. Those are harder and take more time because a lot of the documents needed to understand what's happening are off at regional sites. So the INS files in downtown DC, we call it A1, right? Archives 1. Those are just more decentralized, even though they're at the center of the archives, and just harder to follow. but I could use some context that was there for the German Jewish Children's Aid in chapter 5. So those were my archival sources. I also had contact with reference specialists at various sites. At one point, I had an archivist from the University of Alaska at Fairbanks email me a couple sources. I
We're going to
had a
get to the
lot of
Alaska part of this, I promise.
I had a lot of reference support from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, mainly through friends who worked there that sent me many sources throughout my time writing this book.
It's so interesting how many people miss this story. A lot of times when I interview an author, I go and I go into the Wikipedia page and I will just do Control F and look and see if what the author has written about is in just the standard batch of knowledge on a person or a subject. And what's amazing is the words Jewish and Nazi are not even in her Wikipedia entry.
She was not Jewish, though some conspiracy theorists claimed that she was for various reasons. And I mean, Nazi Germany unfolded at the same time as the Roosevelt administration, so it was definitely happening at the same time.
How much well, but I guess the question I'm asking is why did so many people miss this story in this
Oh, okay.
relationship?
I
Yeah.
spend the last 3 chapters of my book on that. And this is a question that fascinates me, which is how myths change over time to obscure narratives. So third to last chapter is about the historical memory of the Holocaust in the US, which has taken a complicated history of its own. The second to last chapter is about the myth of a nation of immigrants, the myth that the US has always been welcoming to immigrants, right, via the Statue of Liberty, Great American Melting Pot from Schoolhouse Rock, and how that myth made the bent of the story difficult for me to see when it was my senior thesis over a decade ago. I came into it thinking that she probably saved people left and right, but the reality is that the laws and the contours of the country made it impossible for her to do that. And then the last chapter of my book tells the story of the forgetting of Frances Perkins over time and only the recent memory of her. She did not seek out attention. When she wrote a memoir to earn money after her tenure as labor secretary, it was about Franklin D. Roosevelt, and she attributed what she worked on to him because that's just what she did. And then she had a little bit of a moment around what would have been her 100th birthday in 1880. That was when the Labor Department building was named after her. There was also a postage stamp with her face on it. In 1987, the movie Dirty Dancing specifies that its main character, Baby, is named, quote, Frances, after the first woman in the cabinet, end quote. When I spoke about this book at a synagogue recently, the costume designer from Dirty Dancing was there, and she told me that they named the character Frances because it was like naming someone Joan of Arc. Like it was just kind of a saintly, sacred, righteous person. But by the 1990s, she was largely forgotten. And then in the early 2000s, journalist Kirsten Downey was on a bus tour of DC because she had out of town guests. And the tour guide made a joke that Frances Perkins was in labor for 12 years. Kirsten Downey thought that that was misogynist, but interesting. She wanted to find out where the
She
heck
was
this came
in
from.
labor for 12 years. I'm getting it now. That's right.
And she did. And Kirsten Downey wrote a book called The Woman Behind the New Deal that is still the leading biography of Frances Perkins. Mine is more of a policy narrative nonfiction. And The Woman Behind the New Deal has really made the rounds. There are many people that care about Perkins' story because of that book, including Senator Elizabeth Warren, who delivered a speech about her at the site of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire when Warren was running for president in fall 2019.
As a Jewish woman, how important was this story to you?
I have never specifically sought out to be a scholar of Jewish history, which is a part of my personal life. However, I am repeatedly drawn to it. My dissertation also had a significant Jewish component. I was looking at religious state relations. and ended up looking at a lot of resistance to Sunday laws from Jewish perspectives. In this story, I mean, back in summer 2014, I was looking for a senior thesis topic. I had bounced among possible topics in philosophy and even sociology before landing on this one. When I interned for biographer and journalist Kirsten Downey that summer, 2014. When she told me about the topic, I don't usually include this in the story because I think that there are many things that draw us to research, and identity is only one among many. She did tell me that she thought it would be a good fit for me because I'm Jewish, and um, sometimes that's the case. I mean, it's nice to connect with, for example, people at my temple over this history. There's been a lot of interest in it.
As the I want to get back to the plot now here. I want to ask how she reacted to Kristallnacht as the Holocaust starts to, at least in Germany, explode. I mean, it is, there's all kinds of conflicting narratives about when word of what was happening really made it to the United States, and out of Nazi Germany. How did she start to react to this night of broken glass and to this ensuing threat?
Let me lead up to it slowly but swiftly. Well, okay, that doesn't make sense. But anyway, so in 1933,
Consistently, yeah.
she fought the State Department over a thing called charge bonds, which maybe we'll talk about. If we don't, that's okay too.
Yeah, yeah.
1934, late 1934 into 1935, she's lifting a new child refugee program off the ground. 1936 and 1937, she's starting to face backlash and hate mail and conspiracy theories that she's Jewish over her decision not to deport a communist labor organizer who capitalists didn't like. This man happened to be born in Australia. They wanted to send him back and they wanted to impeach her for not doing that. Those are all things that happened before Kristallnacht in November 1938. She had been concerned with the plight of refugees the whole time. But suddenly, after Kristallnacht, she was not. I mean, she was never the only one thinking about it, but suddenly there were many more people thinking about it. American support for refugees from Nazi Germany went from next to nothing to a little bit. There were celebrities, people in Hollywood who were speaking out about it. Journalist Dorothy Thompson was still outspoken about helping refugees. She was on a national speaking tour in the 1930s about what was going on in Germany. So suddenly after Kristallnacht, there was support. And what Perkins did was she came to a cabinet meeting in late 1938 with sort of 4 ideas that were all things that she had already been working on, that had already been on her radar since the beginning of the administration. One of them was mortgaging the quotas for a couple of years so that more people could come from Germany while there was an immediate threat. Another one was expanding child refugee policy, which she had already been working on through the Children's Bureau, but through congressional legislation. And that idea had a lot of support. It became the Wagner-Rogers bill in summer 1939. It did not make it to a floor vote in Congress. It did not have that much support. But after Kristallnacht, there was more momentum behind it. She was one of several governmental officials who supported opening a separate quota once it became clear that they couldn't let in additional child refugees, an additional quota in the American colonized territory of Alaska that went to Congress in the form of the King-Havner Bill in summer 1940.
The Alaska part is fascinating.
So the Alaska part, I knew that I had read in secondary scholarship that she was one of the voices behind it. I was surprised when I received a couple of letters from the archives at the University of Alaska at Fairbanks where she's talking about it. And the letters were dated 1935. Not 1938, not 1939, not 1940. So this is what I mean by she had her wheels spinning earlier. She was talking to a bishop on the ground in Alaska. who the letters indicate that she had met in person. She did not go to Alaska. Harold Ickes went to Alaska, the Secretary of the Interior, but she was supporting the Interior Department to get involved with this, and they did. And let's see, what else was she doing? Oh, the biggest thing that she did after Kristallnacht, by biggest, I mean that this saved the highest number of lives, was the repeated extension of visitor visas. She had already been doing that, but after Kristallnacht, President Roosevelt delivered at a press conference a speech where he said that it would be cruel and inhumane to kick them out, the German Jewish people who are already in the US. So then he made what she had been doing in this patchwork piecemeal system behind the scenes, he made it the official policy of the executive branch.
What was she up against, both within the administration and in the view of fellow Americans?
Reasons why the people who wrote hate mail to her didn't like her included that she was a woman, that by being a woman in public office, she didn't necessarily follow traditional conventions, that she was a progressive, that she had been integral to New Deal legislation that they despised, like Social Security, the legal mechanisms for strikes and unions, the Fair Labor Standards Act protecting workers. They didn't like her for those things. There was her immigration policy. They did not like how she had reformed the system. And it would have been convenient for their narrative if she was Jewish, so they concocted a conspiracy theory claiming that she was actually a Russian Jewish immigrant named Matilda Watsky, because there was a Russian Jewish immigrant named Matilda Watsky who had married a guy named Paul Wilson. That was also the name of Frances Perkins's husband, because Paul and Wilson are both common names, and that was a thing that she
But
actually
conspiracy
responded.
theorists, they're nothing if not creative.
I don't want to, yeah, okay, that's fair. I don't want to give them too much credit just because it's so absurd, but she actually responded to that one, and she almost never responded to criticism. So those are reasons why people who sign letters, an American taxpayer, an American citizen for 50 years, an average American voter, a true American, those are reasons why they didn't like her. Within the government, she had some serious adversaries in Congress who tried to impeach her in early 1939. She also clashed repeatedly with several members of the State Department. She had a decent working relationship with Secretary of State Cordell Hull, but there were some men who worked for him who were consistently urging the president to fire Perkins, which, I mean, she offered to resign and he didn't let her. He wanted to keep her. Franklin D. Roosevelt and Frances Perkins had a great working relationship throughout the administration. However, the ways that he prioritized politics sometimes sidelined her and her priorities, especially on the issue of immigration. Maybe not so much in the New Deal legislation arena.
What's amazing is she actually is on the receiving end of an impeachment hearing, and we hear very seldom about a potential impeachment of, oh, well, I guess actually during the previous administration, there were Republican calls for Mayorkas to be impeached, but
Yes.
I think he was director of Homeland Security. Seems like so long
Which is
ago.
where the INS is. Yes.
Interesting. Yeah, interesting. Always over immigration. How did these impeachment hearings take shape?
A man named Harry Bridges immigrated to the U.S. in 1920 from Australia. In 1933, he became the spokesperson for a group of dock workers on the West Coast. In 1934, Harry Bridges led a strike that was successful, and that did not create problems for the Secretary of Labor until the following year, 1935, when Congress passed the National Labor Relations Act, also known as the Wagner Act, which provided legal mechanisms for strikes, unions, and collective bargaining. And then the people who opposed the Wagner Act, both in Congress and the hate mail creators, um, in Congress, people connected her support of strikes and unions with her support for alleged communist immigrants, including Harry Bridges. And that's when she started receiving negative attention from Congress and, again, average Americans for not deporting Harry Bridges, who once again had been in the US since 1920. And when he led the strike, there was not immediate backlash against it from Congress. It was only after the Wagner Act.
And the impeachment really hamstrings her the rest of the administration.
So that was all up until 1935. And then gradually it evolved into an impeachment hearing in early 1939.
Hmm. When it
So it happened slowly. One other detail that I should have already said is that before Perkins combined immigration and naturalization bureaus, consolidated authority, initiated reforms, previously, someone who worked for the Immigration Bureau would have been able to arrest and deport an immigrant without seeking approval. Under Perkins, they had to apply to do that. So that was a change that she had made that slowed deportations. In 1937, her commissioner of immigration, who was 100% aligned with her, Daniel McCormick, he died suddenly while at a meeting on Capitol Hill. I believe his appendix exploded, sadly. And then the new commissioner of immigration, James Hoftelling. I've always pronounced it Hoftelling, though my audiobook narrator says hodling, and maybe she's right. She probably looked it up. So then he gradually reversed that rule. So by the time she is impeached, immigration has become slightly less progressive anyway. And then after 1939, the impeachment resolution made her a bit of a political third rail, and it also reinforced the issue of immigration itself as a political third rail. The president didn't want to go anywhere near it.
I want to ask about the ship full of refugees that were turned around. That was the
St. Louis.
It's the St. Louis. I'm sorry. Yeah, the St. Louis. I think it's about 1,000 people, just under 1,000 people who were aboard that ship. What was her view of that? Did she have an impact on that discussion?
That was Congress. Congress makes the laws of who can come in under the quota. And because of the quota, FDR could not let people stay. Perkins's work was largely separate. Visitor visas were something that she had a say in. The St. Louis was originally supposed to go to Cuba, and then Cuba decided at the last minute that they could not go, which is how they ended up so close to the US, and the St. Louis received a lot of attention from the media. Um, my answer on this is always, well, that was the legislative branch. She's in the executive branch. And that is correct. And that is a point that historians Richard Brightman and Alan Lichtman make in the book FDR and the Jews. However, as I'm thinking about it more, it's also an important story for contrast, because what she is doing is working creatively in the system. She is not, shepherding and safe housing people who've arrived at American shores. Like my great uncle, who was in the Navy in World War II, brought in a refugee boy into the U.S. and it was like just shepherd him in, said this guy's with me, and brought him in. I mean, this is family lore, but anyway, I actually think this did happen. That is not what Frances Perkins was doing. She was not letting people who arrived on a ship come in against the law. She was actually following the law. And I do not mean to imply any moral or normative implication for the National Origins Act of 1924. But the people on the St. Louis, the reason that they got trapped and many of them ended up dying in the Holocaust was because the quota numbers were so low and Congress did that.
Is it possible to put a number, a round number, or a specific number on how many people Frances Perkins saved?
Tens of thousands. The Holocaust Museum website says that most of them would be from the visa extensions after Kristallnacht. The child refugee program saved nearly 1,000 children. Sometimes it would bring over only one boat. I'm sorry, only one child on a boat. Like bring over a whole boat for one child. That was very much the spirit of the program, was that an individual life was worth saving. Of course, when we look at the broader story of American responses to the Holocaust, most people died. Like, this is a sad story no matter what, but it's still looking at what an individual still worth looking at what an individual can do in the face of overwhelming obstacles and backlash.
Yeah, no kidding. How many or what is the impact of Frances Perkins on either current immigration policy or current immigration politics?
Yeah, I'll tell you what my answer would have been before and after. So I recorded many podcasts before the book came out, right? And this is always a question, and I would give an answer about individual versus collective responsibility. That when individuals are oppressive, collectives can form solidarity and resist. That when collectives are oppressive, there are still measures that an individual can take bravely. That was before the election. My book came out the day after the election. We're now recording, I mean, sorry, not the election, the inauguration.
Oh.
So the previous answer was shaped by the election. Current answer is shaped by the administration so far. My book came out on January 21st. So that was the day after the inauguration of Trump 2.0. And now my answer is that no one can do everything. Frances Perkins was never acting alone. She was always working with her solicitor of labor, her commissioner of immigration, the Children's Bureau. She had allies in Congress. She had this incredible person, Cecilia Rozovsky, in her networks. Cecilia Rozovsky in the 1930s was executive secretary of the German Jewish Children's Aid Incorporated, which was the organization behind the child refugee policy in the Labor Department. They were raising the money, they were finding the foster homes. Cecilia Rozovsky did all of that, but she couldn't do that alone. Cecilia Rozovsky was a community builder. She canvassed Jewish communities. She found people who were willing to collaborate. Nobody can do everything alone, and so much about this is identifying what you can do and how you can work with other people. Those are two important ways that Frances Perkins sets an example.
I love that. I love that. How did October 7th impact your view of what Perkins did?
I had a deadline of December 1st, 2023 on my manuscript. When everything went to terror in Israel, Palestine, more so than it had previously, I had already written all but the last 2 chapters of the book. I had already written chapter 11. I had already completed a draft of chapter 11, which is the story of historical memory of the Holocaust in the U.S. I'm glad that I finished the draft of that chapter beforehand, because it would have been more daunting afterward. Okay, so I just answered the question based in 2023.
Yeah.
Since then, let's go back to the point from earlier. You can't convince people to care if they don't. I don't know why she cared, really, right? She did. Her experiences shaped her in that direction, but like you said earlier, some people witnessed the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. I mean, the factory owners witnessed pieces of it and were defensive rather than remorseful. Um, just so much suffering. Like a human life is a human life.
Which recent cabinet secretary, male or female, is most like Frances Perkins?
Oh, well, I'm definitely not afraid of an I don't know. So I might say I don't know. I can tell you what people in politics remind me of her and why. During inauguration week, the bishop at the National Cathedral, what was her name? Her last name is
Slips
Buddy.
in my mind too.
Marion, maybe Marion Edgar Buddy.
Uh-huh.
She spoke directly to President Trump and she said to have mercy for people who are immigrants, people who are LGBTQ plus. Um, Especially because Perkins was a devout Episcopalian. The speech just reminded me of Perkins. I say in chapter 13, actually, that Elizabeth Warren tends to align with Frances Perkins. When Warren dropped out of the presidential race in 2020, she delivered a speech where she said, only righteous fights. I mean, that was Perkins's MO for sure.
Do you know if you'll do another book? Did you like this enough? Or did you
I
hate it?
I missed writing it as soon as it was done.
Hmm.
I switched jobs a few months after writing it, and now I'm working on the semi-quincentennial, the 250th anniversary of the US at Brown University. And I'm teaching a class in the fall called The American Revolution in Popular Culture. It goes from 1976 to the present. I'm currently writing a book on that topic, and I'm
Oh,
excited about it. It is
cool.
not under contract yet while we're recording, but I loved writing this book. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to have done so. And to be honest, I wanted to do it again as soon as I finished.
That's awesome. That's awesome. It's so many authors tell me the old phrase, "Wouldn't it be fun to write a book?" And they're all like, "No, it would not be." um, I want to ask about your dedication. I love asking about dedications. Yours is for Brandon. Very simple. I want to ask, who is Brandon, and why did you decide this book should be for him?
So I was married to Brandon Graham for almost 5 years. Our marriage actually ended shortly after finishing the book. We are
Oh
still,
gosh, we'll talk about an awkward question.
that's okay. We are still very close. Brandon was the first editor for every chapter. He was the first reader for every page. He read most pages multiple times. I think he's very talented at it. And I mean, what I say in the acknowledgments is that by the end, when I was writing, it's like, well, how is this going to go over with Brandon? And I mean, after we decided not to stay married to each other, we still did lots of counseling and ended up in a place where we still plan for him to be my first reader and editor on my second book as I'm writing it, with explicitly good boundaries that are best for everyone. But I'm so thrilled that my book remains dedicated to Brandon. It like truly from me is for him. And a book is representative of the author's life and thinking at the time of creating it. Books are created by humans. And when I wrote Dear Miss Perkins, I was a full-time high school history teacher and wife. I am no longer either of those things, but this book is written by someone who was.
Well, I tell you, you never know what you're going to get when you ask that question. Who's this book dedicated to and why?
How did I
Uh,
do?
a fascinating answer that's going to enrich this episode, I'm sure, and the minds of the people who listen to it. Dr. Rebecca Brenner Graham, the author of Dear Miss Perkins, a story of Frances Perkins' efforts to aid refugees from Nazi Germany. Thank you so much for being here and doing this.
Thank you for having me.
Check out the book and her website, RebeccaBrennerGraham.com. She's on the website formerly known as Twitter at the other RBG. That is funny. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports, History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axelbank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.